Hollywood, where Mr. Temple signed books for the cast of Criminal Minds and Major Crimes. I missed that trip because I was supposed to go with him. Those are my favorite people. He signs books and speaks at churches, schools, libraries, and civic clubs across the nation, and does interviews on radio and TV from Alaska to Los Angeles, Dallas to Detroit, and Boston to Florida. He has also been on Israeli national radio. He also canceled his trip to Florida to be with us this morning, and we thank him. Mrs. Temple is with him. The major sacrifice. Thank you so much, Mr. Temple.
Yes, Judy's the one who should be applauded. I told her I would like to delay our trip. We usually go down in the fall down to Okaloosa Island down at Fort Walton Beach. And we go down there to relax and recharge our batteries and to write and to edit. That's where I usually go when I'm getting close to finishing a book. So I go down there to edit. I see some familiar faces here this morning, and people I've run across. And if you've heard any of this talk before, I'm sorry I may repeat myself a little bit. But I sure am glad that we stayed because librarians and libraries have been so important to us. School libraries, church libraries, county libraries, university libraries. We run into people all the time who read these books, and that's how they accessed these books. And so thank y'all for helping us get the word out, because in addition to being good novels to read, we hope, this is a ministry to us. And a promise I made to God a long time ago that I would write 3 books as fiction, but drawn from my life, 3 or 4 lives in one that I've led, the good, the bad, and the tragic. And so that's why Barbara and I talked about the title. I said, well, how about writing nonfiction as fiction, and digging up bones, embracing a lot of pain, and remaining true to my faith in a secular book and publishing world, which is not always easy. And believe me, it's not always easy when you go to Hollywood either. And but it's been quite a journey for us, and just amazing, what God has done for us. And when I wrote Ghostly Shade of Pale, the first draft of Ghostly, I wasn't sure that anybody outside of my friends and loved ones would care to read it. And when I did the first draft, actually I hated it. I was learning. People had told me throughout my life, you have a gift for writing. They said you should try the great American novel. And so I said, okay, I think I will, and I did, and I found out it's pretty hard. It's quite different. Writing a big book like Ghostly Shade of Pale has a lot of threads in it, a lot of timelines and characters, and to make it flow and arrive with integrity at the end, and make sure you don't forget somebody's nickname or misapply the age or who they met or the associations. And believe me, readers will find and point out to you, all the errors that you make. And so it was kind of tricky. And because I've written a lot in my life, but usually op-ed pieces when I was in the corporate world, and some things when I was in law enforcement in my early days right out of Ole Miss, and speeches for political candidates. And I've had an interesting life, met a lot of the icons of the 20th century, and some of it was very tough times, but it was all great fodder for a novelist in his old age. And so we did that, and the first draft, I said I didn't care for it at all. I said, this is terrible. This is the worst thing I've ever seen. And then I kind of walked away from it a while. I came back, and God showed me, what I needed to do. And I began at page 1 all the way to the end, and I began adding descriptors. And when I did, the characters began to pop up off the page. They became living, breathing entities, and you could see what they saw and hear what they heard and feel what they felt. or as my lovely wife Judy is fond of telling people, when Michael, the character based on me in this novel, when Michael is driving down the dirt road, you can taste the dirt. And that's, I tell novelists now, when I talk to them, or just starting out like I did, I said, that's what you want to aim for, that visual book. And so many reviews that we get are, they have a common thread. They say it's so visual, it's like reading a movie. And and everybody said, well, this will lend itself to a movie or TV series. And when we were finishing the manuscript before the book had been published, I knew cousin of Jim Clementi, who's the writer-producer at Criminal Minds, and Criminal Minds is really based on his life. He was in the BAU, the Behavioral Analysis Unit, top profiler for the FBI, and he was also a first responder at Ground Zero. And he got cancer breathing the dust off the towers, like so many of the first responders did, and he's really a national hero. And wish I'd have known all of y'all back in May, because Jim came here and he spent 3 nights with us at the house. And we had a public reception for him. The governor came, and they gave him the key to the city in Tupelo, and it was quite a day. And you know, at the end of that, you know, Jim he grew up in New York City and he lives in L.A. And so he looks at us. He said, you know, Merle, he said, people here in Mississippi, they're just not like people in New York City and L.A. I said, yeah, that's right, Jim, you got that right. And so consequently out of that, Jim and his partners called the other day from Hollywood, and he said, we're pitching a new TV series now for cold case murder cases. And he said, we were so graciously received by Mississippians, we want to base that show in Mississippi if it's picked up by E&E, and it's under negotiation now. The lawyers are talking. And he said, if you could help us, we know you know a lot of people in the old days in law enforcement, found us some good stories, and they said, if we sell this, we want you to be the host, narrator, and we're going to make you associate producer. And I said, I'm ready. I said, I got my old, for those of y'all who remember, I got my old Robert Stack trench coat from Unsolved Mysteries. I told him, I can see myself, kind of walking out of the fog, my coat turned up around like Bogey and Casablanca, and I come out of the fog and I say it was a cold, dark night in 1979 in Booneville, Mississippi. And so, it's been crazy, but it started all off. I sent a note to Jim in Hollywood, and I said, I know your cousin. And I said, I've written this manuscript. Do you think you could read it for me and tell me if it's any good, or if I should do humanity a favor and burn all copies on a midnight ceremony or something? And he said, sure. He said, I will. And he told me later, he said, I get so many, and most of them were terrible that people asked me to. But he told the news people here that, and he said very kind things about me. But anyway, I said it to him, and he said, we're busy, it may take a while, we're filming at Criminal Minds and doing specials. And so about 2 months went by, and I was getting pretty anxious. But I knew not to ask again, not to press. And one day, I logged on, and there in my inbox, I saw an email from Jim Clementi in Hollywood. And I was afraid to open it. I just knew he was going to say, why did you waste my time with this dribble and didn't give up your day job, did you? And so I opened it, and he said, I'm sorry it took so long. He said, we've been really busy filming. He said, but I'm not quite done. He said, I had to stop and write and tell you. He said, you're not only a great writer, you're a great writer of American literature. That's what this is, a big crime stories literature. Come to Hollywood, I want to represent you. And then I'm sitting there at the computer, and I turned and I screamed through the house, Judy, you'll never believe it. And so that started it all off for us, and we loaded up the Murano with so many books. you know, across I-40, we hit a bump, it was just bump. There were no springs left. And I finally figured out I exceeded the weight limit of the car and all that kind of stuff. But what an adventure, you know, what an adventure that was. And just before I left, people told me, they said, well, you know, you're a Christian. You should try to get on KKLA while you're out in Hollywood. That's the largest Christian radio station in America. And then they kind of snickered, you know, like, that's really going to happen. And I said, well, okay. And so I look on the website for KKLA and can't find a producer. That's who I always look for, you know, producers book guests. And I said, well, I'm going to look at the host. I don't know why I didn't know any of them, but I hit the drop down thing and they all dropped down. And then the Lord just said, that's the one right there, Frank Sontag. And I didn't know that he had the largest show on the largest station. I couldn't find a contact for him. I said, I bet they got a Facebook page for his show alone. And I hop over there, and sure enough, the Frank Sontag show. And I said, well, I'm going to take a chance and just shoot a message into the blind to the page. And on-air host, talent, they never check Facebook. Producers do sometimes. So I shot it in there and went back to typing on my desk, and about 15 minutes later, my private line rang on my desk. I hear a radio voice saying, Merle, this is Frank Sontag in Los Angeles. I said, well, hello, Frank. He said, no, you don't understand. He said, I'm never in the studio this time of day. I'm not supposed to be here for hours. He said, but something would not leave me alone at home. I couldn't shake it. I had to go to the station. He said, I went in, and when I got here, nothing would do but that I checked the Facebook page. And he said, you must understand, Merle, that I never, ever, ever, ever checked the Facebook page. And I said, well, Frank, I said, I think this is a God thing. And he had me tell that on the air. They gave me an hour drive time from 5 to 6 to give my story, my testimony to Southern California. And so that was a great arrival for us. And Judy and I barely survived riding the freeways of LA, getting lost, getting run over, getting stuck in places you would not want to break down. And we finally got there, and it was a wonderful experience. They treated us so well. And they had bumper music on, of course, to introduce each segment when we break and come back. And Frank and I would talk during the breaks, and he said, Merle, we're coming back, you better get your headphones on. I put my headphones on. The first thing I heard was the bumper music coming up, and it was Elvis singing Peace in the Valley, just for me. And I looked up, the producers in the booth were going like this. And Frank said, you recognize that bumper music, Merle? And I said, I like that. And so 2 days later, we were totally unknown then, and 2,000 miles from home, and weren't in any of the chains, bookstore chains or anything. And so we had to beg consignment sales in those days. And so we were signing at a Lifeway store in the edge of LA, but people had heard us on KKLA, and they poured into the store, and we signed 100 books. There was more than anybody ever had except Charles Stanley. And I said, well, he's been on TV for 60 years. That's a pretty good company to be in. And so that kind of started it all off. And then we were going to Criminal Minds. But first they said, we got this big insider TV show set up for you in Beverly Hills. And they're going to interview you before we take you out to the set. And so it was Allison Hope Weiner, big entertainment lawyer in Hollywood. And her brother created Mad Men on TV, and so we headed out there, and we were driving through Beverly Hills, and Judy and I were gawking at all the iconic images around us, you know, like two bumpkins from Mississippi. And that's why I looked at Judy, and I said, Judy, I said, we are the Beverly Hillbillies. I said, all we need is Granny up on top in a rocking chair, and we'd be complete. So we got there, just had a great time, and they were so gracious to us. A young man, the assistant producer, came up to mic me, and he looked familiar, sort of, and it turns out he looked like his daddy. When his daddy was young, he was Will Gibson Mel's son. and he looked kind of like Mel did back in the Mad Max days, for those of y'all who remember that movie he broke out on. And I said, well, how's your daddy doing? He said, he's doing great. And I said, here, let me sign a book for him. And so we did that and wound up signing one through intermediaries later for Robert De Niro and different people. And that was a great interview. It's up on YouTube, Merle Temple at Media Mayhem in Beverly Hills, if you ever want to watch it. It was one of the best interviews we ever had. She asked hard questions. And she was a pro, and she was not a Christian. But at the end, she said, well, this is a Christian themed book. She told our audience, but she said, you got to get it. The writing is so good. So it's just like God had planned it. And so we left there. And, I got to tell you, while we were waiting, we went out on the sidewalk restaurant. And by the way, any of y'all are on Facebook, feel free to friend me at Merle Temple. We post a lot of interesting things. And I posted this picture. It went viral out there. And they said, oh, they're trying to get you, country boy. And they came out, and Jim and Judy and I were have a little snack before the filming, and they brought us this kind of like appetizer, and it was this, they said it was kale chips, but it was a bowl of leaves. There's nothing chip about it. It looked like leaves that I had been raking up in my yard, and somebody sprinkled a little Parmesan on it. And I looked at that, and I said, man, I'm from Mississippi. I don't know if I can eat that or not. And Jim said, yeah, we don't want that. And so I put that out, and everybody laughed about it, had a big time out of it. But we wound up, we pulled in. I'll tell you, it was quite an experience, in the fairy tale that it was when you pull up to the gates of the big studio where Criminal Minds film, been on TV for 10 years, and Jim roars through in his little sports car. We're following him, and the guards there is waving us right on through like we're somebody. And they said, you park right here. It is right next to Mark Gordon, who owns Criminal Minds and is the biggest of the big producers in Hollywood. He's the president of the National Producers Guild. So I'm telling you, we got out, we're looking, and it was such a big deal. I leaned over my camera and I took a picture of his parking space. So I should show people I parked next to Mark Gordon's parking space. And then we went in, and it was such a great experience, and they were so gracious to us, and we had to remember certain things. There was a young lady we knew, and she said, when you meet Matthew Gray Gubler, would you tell him that I love him? And I said, I will, and we did. We met Matthew and took pictures, and Shamar Moore, and I told Shamar, I said, I've been following you since the Young and the Restless. He said, oh, the Malcolm days. I said, oh, the Malcolm days. And met Joe Mantegna, who's been in so many movies and was in Godfather 3. And I told Joe, I said, Judy and I have only been married a few years, and she'd never seen the Godfather series. And I said, I just showed her Godfather 3, where you were brutally murdered in the streets of New York City for opposing Al Pacino, the Godfather. And Joe said, well, I've been brutally murdered many times, inside and outside the movies, talking about critics. And I met Thomas Gibson, plays Hotch in the series, and we watched him film. We sat in the jet plane, make pictures, and they feed you so well in Hollywood on the sets. Everywhere you go, there's just stacks and stacks of food, and when they're walking you along, so you hungry? And you go to the next little stand, you hungry? And the stars and the cast and everybody who comes in, they want for nothing, food-wise. And it was quite an experience, and they have these big, you can see them in some of these some of these pictures here on the board. They have these big, kind of like mobile dressing rooms out behind the studio lots, and they're dressing rooms for each, and they're really fancy. And right behind them are the mountains wrapped around, and we're making pictures out there, and many times during that whole experience, Judy and I we would if we were eating somewhere with somebody, we'd reach up on the table and pinch each other to make sure we weren't dreaming that this was all real. And so it was quite a day, and we signed books there for they had met the producer, the boss, the executive producer, and showrunner, and signed books for everybody, and they were just so gracious. And just heard from Jim last night. So I'll get back with you on some things. He said, I'm real busy right now. He said, we're about to film the episode, the latest one I've written. And and when Jim went out to Hollywood, after he got cancer, he really had to battle it. He had a bone marrow transplant and had chemo, and he was in isolation from the bone marrow transplant when Manny Potemkin, who used to be on Criminal Minds in the early days after he left ER, he came up there, wanted to talk to some people in the FBI to talk about this show, and he wanted to be on it and so forth. And he asked him, he wasn't happy, and Manny's kind of hard to please in those days. He said, isn't there anyone in the FBI has any personality? They said, well, the committee does, but he's in isolation. So he calls Jim, said, I'm Manny Potemkin. And he said, hello, I'm Manny Potemkin. And Jim said, sure you are. That's Jim. And he said, I'm coming over, I need to talk to you. And Jim said, no, you can't, I'm in isolation. But I'll put on my mask and my gloves, and he said, I'll meet you at Starbucks. And they did, and that started it all off, and Jim helped them set up that show. And then when he got really sick, the doctors said, you know, you might want to be like Horace Greeley, you know, you might want to go west, young man, and have a change of scenery and a change of occupation. And so Jim did, and during the middle of all that process too, Jim had some heart attacks, and he flatlined once for an hour. And they give up on you at like, what, 26, 28 minutes, and they brought him back. He said he was glad his doctor didn't have a pressing appointment that day. And they brought him back with no brain damage, which is a miracle. And I think God has something for Jim to do. And you know, really truly, I think if he was holding on so he could meet us, you know. And so Jim's been such a great friend to us. He went out to Hollywood and made it big. And throughout his career in the FBI as a top profiler, he carried a picture of a little boy in his billfold. It was his first case that he helped save this little boy who was abducted. And he continued to carry that, and he carried it with him and still carries it today, and he shows it to all the stars at Criminal Minds to remind them what the bigger picture is here, and that it's about kids that are vulnerable to predators and things like that, and he carries that picture to keep him grounded and keep them grounded. You know, that this is not just a job, it's not just a TV show. He told me, said, Merle, in all of my speeches, you know, at academies and conventions, he said, I figure maybe I'd reached 100 to 150,000 people working hard to tell them how to protect their children, about laws to help local law enforcement, and he said the first episode I wrote on child abduction on Criminal Minds, he said it reached like 20 million people, and that was just in the U.S. And he said it's gone, and then it goes into reruns, and Criminal Minds is everywhere, you know, on all the different networks, and people buy their packages. There are so many people who are really, rabid fans. I told them, I said, y'all will never know what you've done for me. I said, the Criminal Minds connection. I said, people will come into bookstores and sometimes, and I said, hey, I said, we greet everybody. Never meet a stranger like my mother. I said, I said, hey, would y'all like to sign a good signed book? No, I'm not interested in that. I said, you're a fan of Criminal Minds? Stop dead in their tracks. They turn around, I love that show. And I said, you'll never know. And when we first kicked off and signed at Reed's Gumtree, downtown Tupelo, they called us from Hollywood. And they said, congratulations, best wishes on your launch. They said, soon the whole world will know what we know, what a great writer you are. They said, can we say we discovered you? I said, after all y'all done for me, you can say anything you want to. You say you found me unconscious on the side of the road, revived me, and I began to write if you want to. And so it's just been you know, quite a journey. And but I would tell you, it's you know, it's a challenge. You know that when you, Judy said, when you finish the third book that I'm writing now, I was up last night. The chapter I just wrote, I read it to Judy, and I cried and she cried. So when that happens, you know, something bigger than you is taking place. And she said, you ought to have, for fun, you should just write a pure fiction book someday without having to draw up and dig up all those bones and embrace all that pain. But you know, that's what I promised God I would do, to tell that story. So Ghostly Shade of Pale is probably 60 to 70% based on things that really happened, and A Readied World, the sequel, is probably 90%, and The Redeemed would probably be 90%. And so it's kind of a struggle sometimes when you're, as a writer, when you're writing a book that you want to be entertaining and to be authentic, and but at the same time, you know, you're trying to follow a sequence of events that happened to be true to that and to the real people that have characters in those books. And when the first book was coming out, my first publisher was real worried. She said, anybody in this book going to recognize themselves and want to show up and kill us? Because I was in law enforcement in the Bureau of Narcotics in those days and dealt with a lot of bad people. And I said, no, I said, most of the people who would really object if they recognize themselves are no longer with us, either by natural or unnatural causes due to the lifestyle they led. And but in Ghostly is based on when I left Ole Miss in the early 70s. President Nixon had just declared the first war on drugs, and I foolishly decided probably that's the place for me, and naively decided, and went into that. And the Bureau of Narcotics in Mississippi was brand new, modeled after the DEA, the new DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, which combined the old Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs at the federal level, customs, and some other things. And so I went into that, and there weren't very many of us in the early days. And if you were out working deep undercover, working solo undercover, you know, it could be pretty bad if you got into some trouble, because, you know, the good guys weren't coming to rescue you. The cavalry wasn't coming because there wasn't any. And so we all faced that, and I was in South Mississippi in 1972, and I had a deal set up to buy heroin from some dealers, and they showed up early, and one thing led to another. Next thing I know, we're in the car with them, they're assisting to do that deal late that night, and we're riding out down around the Mississippi-Louisiana border. We're riding out into the country where the highway ended, and then the blacktop ended, and then the dirt road ended, and then we're on like the cow path, bumping along under the trees and the moss, and the tree limbs are dragging and scraping across the car, and you know, you look up and you see the big moons kind of peeking through the upper terraces of the trees, and owls are hooting, and coyotes run by, and all that. And we pull up out in this clearing finally in the middle of nowhere, and there's this old wood frame house on stilts there, and it looked like every scene out of every bad B horror movie you've ever seen. You expected Freddy to jump out with his chainsaw, you know. And so we went in there, and when I walked in, I didn't know they had decided just to keep their product and take my money and kill me. And when I walked in, they put a pistol to my forehead, a shotgun in my stomach, and they began to debate about where to dump my body once they'd kill me. And this was like midnight, and there's nobody coming, nobody knows where I am, and then the one sitting right across from me, just a couple of feet right across from me, looking at me, was a strange guy. He'd just gotten out of Angola prison, which was at that time the worst prison really in the United States. And if you survived that, you had to be tough. And he looked at me, and he pulled out an old double-edged Gillette razor blade. And he looked at me, his eyes never left mine, and he put that razor blade into his mouth, and he bit on it, and he twisted it, and he swallowed it. And then he smiled at me, and when he did, the blood just gushed out and bubbled up at the corners of his mouth and ran down on his throat. And he put his fingers in the back of his mouth, it got out a handful of blood. He said, "Want some?" As he grinned at me, the blood gushing through his teeth. And I said, "I don't believe I care for any." And then he pulled out a whole box of long stem kitchen matches, and he lit them and had that big flame there, midnight, and it's setting, and guns all around, and the talk of killing me, dumping my body, and he's bleeding out, and he bends over with the blood gushing, and he swallows that whole fire into his mouth. And well, it was then that my whole life flashed before my eyes. It does release something. I think I always heard it could release something in your brain when you believe that you're about to die. And I began to see images buried in my subconscious that I didn't have any way of recalling, but I saw myself as a toddler with my parents toddling along, holding their hands, and beautiful things. I wouldn't recommend the stimulus it took to get there, but it was quite beautiful. Just a kaleidoscope of images flashing before my eyes. And I prayed that night, and I wasn't one to pray then. And so I'll leave that story right there. You read in the book. But I did get out of that by the grace of God, and the next year I've been stationed as the second investigator outside of Jackson to have an outside territory in outstate Mississippi. And they put me over in Batesville to have kind of in those days there weren't many of us, and gosh, I had everything from the Delta, lower Delta, all the way up to Memphis as an investigator, a resident agent they called us, and so my reputation had preceded me, and so one day this gangster out of Memphis called me, and he had been wronged by other gangsters when he tried to move into DeSoto County with an organized crime setup, and these new guys, these new crime figures, had bought up political protection down there, and they had moved their operation. We're moving in too, and so they shut him out and just disrespected him. And he wasn't a guy that you disrespected in the old days. He wouldn't have come to me, as he tells Michael in the book. He said, "Old days, I wouldn't have come to you. I'd have handled this myself." He said, "I don't have that kind of muscle anymore." And I said, "Well, let me be the instrument of your revenge." And so he gave us invaluable information. And one night, after a long investigation, filming the coming and goings of this local syndicate and the Dixie Mafia and the larger mafia families, and there was just so much going on there. And it was much like, if y'all remember the old Walking Tall movie, it was much like that, so close to that. And some of the actual people from McNairy County, Tennessee, came down as part of that syndicate. And we hit them one night when they were all gathered at one club, and they had a big high-stakes pool tournament, and they had a lot of money there, and they were dealing drugs table to table. And they had a dice table, which we had seen local police officers help them set up the dice tables, because it was all on the, it was all part of the arrangement. And the dice were loaded, and they had juice machines in the wall, which are magnets that stop the dice. And they had special beers they used to drug people if they couldn't rob them and cheat them outright. They would drug them to get every penny they had. People come in there with their checks. And so we hit them that night, and we just arrested a whole bunch of people. And everybody was stunned because they had bought protection, they thought. And so there were some people who wanted us to notify the locals that we were coming in, and we said, "No, absolutely not. Can't do that, or there won't be anything there when we get there." So we did that, arrested a lot of people, and out of that I made a new informant. One of the young women who was working in the clubs, dealing drugs, a waitress and also prostitute, and she began to tell me what they were doing afterwards. And one day she called me and she said, "Merle, she said they just had a meeting of all the different factions over here at this one club." And I said, "Oh, what are they talking about?" She said, "Pooling their money and who they're going to hire to kill you." And I said, "Oh, they're not going to do that." I said, no matter who else they may be, they're businessmen. That would be terrible for business to kill a state police officer. I said, the wrath of the world would fall on them. You wouldn't be able to move in DeSoto County without bumping into some state or federal agent up there. And she said, no, they're serious. And I was young and thought I'd live forever and a little bit bulletproof. And so a while later, I got a call from a guy. He said, I'm in Memphis, and he said, I have information for you about the people you hit in DeSoto County. And he said, you know, you did good, but you missed some people, and I think you know you did. I can give them to you. I felt a little funny about it, you know, because of what she had told me, but I wanted information above everything else. I wanted to make those cases. And I said, all right, I'll meet you. He didn't want to meet in Memphis. He didn't want to meet in Senatobia. He only wanted to meet in DeSoto County where they had political protection. And I said, all right, finally, I said, I'll meet you there. And he said, I know a little place out in the woods we can meet and be private. And I said, no, we're not meeting out in the woods. I said, I'll meet you at the Horn Lake exit on I-55. It's nothing like it is now. I took Judy by to show her the spot. Jim Clemente wanted to see it. I said, now there's anything there that you could possibly want within walking distance. But then there was nothing but an old abandoned Gulf service station. And I got there, and when I left, I was headed up there, and I got feeling more suspicious of it, and I pulled my gun out of my shoulder holster from beneath my shoulder and put it underneath my belt and closed my jacket over it. And my first wife, who's deceased now, Susan, who was best friends with Judy, she got a call. It was my informant, and she asked for me, and she said, he's not here. And she said, get a hold of him and tell him it's a setup, they're going to kill him, and hung up. Susan tried to reach me through the highway patrol radio, and my police radio had gone out. And she was frantic, not knowing where I was, what to do. And so I arrived, and there was not one guy there but two. I should have drove right away. I should have just left and never slowed down. Jim fusses at me. We're Hollywood. Well, what were you thinking? I said, oh, Jim, I was young, you know, I want to get that case, get that. I said, you know. And so it deteriorated quickly. I let him in my car, which I should have never done. And finally I realized I had messed up, and you know, and I had to put my hand on my guns, and they had their guns, and it's a long story too in the standoff. And it's also written as fiction in a book. I was later promoted and became the first captain over the north half of the state. And the agents had done a heroin deal, some heroin deals with dealers in Columbus. What they were doing was they were taking high-grade, high-purity heroin, and they was creating a market for addicts. They created an addict market at Mississippi State and MUW, MSCW then. And then what they create, the addict market, then they'd come in and cut the purity way down to drive up their profits. They'd have to buy more and more to get the same high and effect they did with the first heroin that they got addicted to. So we decided we were going to, after buying from them, we were going to do one large deal with money, that so much money we couldn't let it walk away. And so that came up quickly, and I had to go out and find $10,000 to $15,000 cash to use as a flash roll. And we were setting that deal up, and we were just going to do that to draw out their backers behind them, who might not trust the front man. If these were the front men, they might not trust them with that much product. And so we had that set up, and agents were waiting on me at Starkville. I was leaving Tupelo. I ran down from the office, which is an old T&S building, for those of y'all who might remember. It's gone now, right by the post office. I ran down, and to jump in my car, because I was running late as always, and I cranked up, put my hand on the gear shift to take off, and when I did, something had never happened to me before in my life. I knew I had favor of God. I'd never understood it. I ran from it, trying to be as good as I could, full workspace salvation mode. But that day I put my hand on the gear shift, and when I did, the Spirit just filled up my car. I had never experienced anything like that in my life, all through me, all around me, everywhere. We were one, whatever it was. And it terrified me, because I had never experienced anything. I thought I was losing my mind. And it said, go back and get the bulletproof vest. And then it was gone from the car. And I'm like, what was that? I'm losing my mind. We don't have any reason to believe it's more dangerous than usual. Agents didn't like to wear the vest in those days. In those days, we only had vests. They didn't have any armor in them. They'd only stop up to like a 38 caliber handgun. And I said, I don't know where that's coming from. I don't know where that was. I put my hand back on the gear shift and then came right back in the car. Wrapped all around me, all through me. It wasn't optional this time. Go back and get the vest. And out loud, I said, okay, okay. I went back, I got the vest, met the agents to set up the deal, and so we could do surveillance and stay close to them. And I said, I want y'all to wear these vests. We don't want to. And I said, no, please, humor me. Don't ask me why. And later, when we were reunited, Judy and I, with some of them, I finally, after nearly 40 years, I was able to tell them why. They weren't ready to receive it then, and frankly, I wasn't ready to receive it then. So they wore the vest. I said, keep it in town in Columbus when you do the deal, so we'll have buildings to stay behind and trees and obstacles so we can hide. You can't have tight surveillance when you're out on a long, flat plain with nothing to hide behind. You kind of stick out. And so they said they would, but it got away from them, and they went south of town, down on this road that wound down, and came up on this high embankment, and depressions on either side. And up here, a railroad cross, and in the depression was this high railroad trestle. And there was a clump of pine trees up there, up high on there, and that's where they had their sniper posted right up there with a high-powered rifle guarding the deal. And so as the agents began to do the deal, we had to back away because there's nothing to hide behind, and the body units on it were cutting in and out, and I was frantic because of what had happened in the car. I was just like on pins and needles. And it was cutting in and out and in and out. We heard them say something about, here's the money, here's the drugs, da, 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 and then it cuts out. I'm with the chief of intelligence, my best friend, in our car, and it comes back in, and we hear, ta, 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 ta. And I looked at Claude, my best friend, I said, Claude, was that gunfire? And then the other agents on the other side in their car said, Merle, they're under fire. And we came across the levee, and there was gun smoke just hanging in the air, thick in the air, floating. It was this eeriest scene that you could imagine. It was a scene of horror and nightmare. This big storm front had come in. I'd never quite seen one like it. These rolling clouds, these dark clouds that just bunched up and seemed to kind of squeeze the life and the light out of every bit of the earth beneath. And later that night, it came this ice storm that it froze everything from Jackson to Corinth in one big sheet of ice. And so we come across, we're caught in a crossfire, and everybody's firing, there's a big gun battle going on, and one thing leads to another, and then the female agent who was on the scene with the male agent making the bio radios, she said, Merle, she said, Jerry's hit bad. She said, he's hit bad, I'm taking him to the hospital. I said, go, go, go. And finally I ordered everybody to stop shooting at shadows, and we thought the sniper had fled, and the violator on the scene had fled, and he was wounded. He went in to draw his weapon, and the female agent shot him as he was coming out, shot him right through the wrist, would have been right through the heart had his hand not been there. So he fled. I knew he would have to go to the hospital in Columbus for treatment, and so I finally left the crime scene in charge of the chief of intelligence. I took off for the hospital, meeting all kind of first responder, local law enforcement units, blue lights blazing, coming out to the crime scene, responding to our call for backup. And I went down to the hospital to walk in and try to comfort the young female agent, because she was in her early 20s, about 21, and she had just shot her first person and seen her partner, critically wounded. And then I went over and I found the violator was there, arrested him, and I walked into the ER and they were cutting the clothes off my friend Jerry. And they got down to that white bulletproof vest that had no armor in it. And it was white, but it was soaked crimson in blood. And as they were taking it off, the doctor said, look at this, Merle. And he had his hands, they were bigger and larger than mine, and it was up in the entry room. He said, look at this. in the chest. He was doing like this. He said, look at this, Merle. He said, one round hit him in the lower extremities. One sliced through his arm, and this one hit him right in the chest. And he said, the high-powered rifle penetrated the vest because it wasn't designed to stop a high-powered rifle. He said, but it took some of the punch out of it, and it deflected it. So it went in behind his right breast, skidded around the barrel of his rib cage, and popped out behind his left breast. He said, Merle, I get chill bumps now. It's been 40 years. Every time I talk about this story, down to my toes. He said, Merle, if he hadn't had that vest on, it had taken his heart and lungs out, he'd been dead before he hit the ground. I'm telling you could hear the shuffle of angels' feet around us there in that ER, and I knew then, still didn't understand it, but I knew that we were not alone. And so all these stories and many more are in there. A lot of stories about corrupt politicians. I know that shocks y'all. They're corrupt politicians. But I'll tell you, when you get a tip and you're sitting out at midnight and you're watching and waiting, you see the big car come up I-55 from New Orleans, out of the fog, and you follow it carefully downtown to the governor's mansion. It pulls up, and you see the doors opened and welcomed by state police officers who are welcoming Carlos Marcello, the most powerful godfather in the country, who many people still think had a role in the deaths of JFK and RFK, because he hated the Kennedys, and Bobby deported him one time, dropping him and his underbosses off in the Guatemalan jungle to walk out or die. And you don't do that to a man whose favorite saying is, 3 people can keep a secret if 2 are dead. And so to see that, not much surprises you after you see him go in and spend 2 hours with the governor of the state. And seen a lot, you see a lot after dark. I want to tell you, under cover of darkness, you kind of begin to see who people maybe really are, instead of who they say they are. And so I've had a lot of encounters in my life. I investigated that governor later, and I had to leave the Bureau of Narcotics. Thought I'd be there forever, but I wouldn't play ball with them, and we embarrassed them when it leaked out that they were forcing a bad guy in as personnel director into the Bureau, so he would then flood the agency with thugs. So they could, because they told us when that governor came in, they said, y'all been flying too high for too long, arresting the wrong people. And they said, we're gonna clip your wings, and they really came after us. But we did that, and they tampered with my witnesses. I had a call from the road near Memphis. I was interviewing witnesses in 3 states about this man who had been abusive to young girls. And they called and intimidated one of my witnesses, and I had to call and tell them, you do that again, and I said, I will resign and call a news conference of every news outlet from Biloxi to Memphis to you name it. I'll give them everything I got. And they backed off. And so we completed it. We won that battle, got that guy gone, but then they began to tell me, Merle, you need to be really careful, friends in Jackson. They said they're looking at everything you're doing. They're afraid to come after you openly because the press likes you. They want to knock that halo off your head, they said, before they come after you. So they're trying to set you up and everything. And so it just got worse and worse. And so I finally, in the midst of that, the corporate world came and offered me a job, and I went into the Bell system reluctantly, leaving my friends and what had been a crusade to us. And I went into the corporate world and later into high-level politics while I was in the corporate world. And in Rented World, I write about that. And I talk about what I call the unholy trinity of politics, crime, and business. And they all get into bed now and then. They pretend they don't, and they scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And a lot of people, I've known a lot of politicians and presidents and senators and ambassadors, or you name it. And a lot of those folks, it's all about money and power. And they'll do anything if you get in their way. And I found out that those people were far more dangerous than the organized crime figures who tried to kill me, because they have the power of the government behind them. and they're masters at eliminating problem folks from their lives. And I warned some of our Christian friends too. I said, some of these people that you think are really good, godly people, I said, I want to tell you, because I've been in that world, some of them, they'll get in, they'll welcome you in, pray with you, and everything, and but once they've got your vote and your money, when you leave, they mock you. They mock you. Because they've decided, some people at those levels, they've decided, they've made a Faustian deal, they've decided they'd rather rule in hell on earth than to serve eternally in heaven. And that's why so many of them are reluctant to retire. Even when they get really old and affirmed, they hang on. It's not just to the power. They equate retirement with death. And they're terrified to stand before their Maker because they know what they've done. As they get toward the end of their life, they start giving money to widows and orphans, and they say, well, I really wasn't such a bad guy, was I? I did some good, didn't I? And it's going to be, I think, when they get to the narrow gate, I think it's going to be kind of tough on them, you know. And so all these things are in my books, and we try to keep faith with our readers, and to warn people wherever we go, this is a dark and dangerous world. And to paraphrase what Thoreau said, you know, it's all necessary to lose yourself is to be turned around once, you know, with your eyes shut. And as I added, sometimes with your conscience kind of muted, as you say, well, I'll make an accommodation here and to defeat the bad guys, I'm going to have to do extraordinary things myself. And you get on that slippery slope, it can really be a bad end to that. And so we're doing that. The first two books have been received so well. As Barbara said, Ghostly is an all-time bestseller at the Barnes & Noble store here. High schools and middle schools are using it here and there. Got to tell y'all, when I got my first call from Winston Academy, the teacher called and said, Merle, Mr. Temple, do you know that we're using your book all the way down to the 8th grade in English classes? I said, wow, really? And that's happened quite frequently now, but I said, wow, that's great. She said, would you come speak? I said, sure I would. And then I hung up and I said, hey, Judy, you won't believe it. They're using Ghostly in English classes. And I went, oh, my English teacher is looking closely at my writing. I could see the red pens coming out, you know, circling all of my mistakes. And then later, the English teachers laughed at me. They said, oh, Merle, I said, that's so yesterday. They said, red ink is so judgmental, we use purple now. I said, what a world. And so it's been quite a journey, and we get cards and letters all the time, and people will tell us, you know, they're teaching Ghostly, using Ghostly here, and they have it here and there, and we just get the nicest letters, emails, private messages on Facebook, and letters from people who write us and tell us, you know, what the books have meant to them, how it's changed their lives. And I'm not ashamed to tell y'all, sometimes when I'm at my desk in front of my computer and I get one of those, I sit there and I cry. I really do. You know, just humbled, you know, that something I wrote, you know, God can use something that somebody as pitiful as I am. And one lady wrote the other day, she said, you don't know us, but we pray for you all the time. She said, my son was in a deep valley of drug abuse, and your book was the first he read. He would call me every night and say, Mama, this happened, and Mama, that happened. And she said, you don't know what that book means to him and what a hero you are to him. And so I sat there and have a little cry, and one lady says, in Jackson, said, I lost my husband on Facebook publicly. She's telling everybody I lost my husband. She said, I'm struggling with it, but then I was out riding the freeways, the interstates around Jackson, and this gray van passed me. And she said, I looked at it and I said, you know, that's a van just like Michael in the book and Clay. It was based on Claude, my best friend, like Michael and Clay would have been out doing surveillance in. And she said, I just can't get that book out of my mind. And then she began to talk about her husband again. And she said, I think I'm getting better because I haven't thought of him now in maybe a half hour. That's the last line in Ghostly. And I get those things, I sit there and I cry. You know, it's so moving, and somebody writes you and tells you they felt God speaking to them through my words. I mean, it just doesn't get any better than that for an author, especially a Christian author. And one lady, one morning I got up, my Facebook was open, and I saw the little private message box open. I went over and this lady said, it was written, she said, "I don't know if you remember me." She said, "But you arrested my husband 40 years ago." And I went, "Uh-oh." I said, "This may not be a really a good one." And I said, "Oh, yeah," she remembered the operation name and everything. I said, "Yeah," I said, I do remember." And I said, "How are you doing? How's he doing?" And she said, "Well, he's gone now." She said, he was sober the last 2 years of his life. That was 40 years ago. And she said, "You were so kind to me back then. I was in nursing school, and they were about to kick me out because they thought I was involved. Said, you made a call to them, told them I was not involved, I was a good person, to leave me alone." And she said, "I went on to be a good, caring nurse for so many people for 40 years. And she said, I owe my life to you." And I sat there and I really cried then, and those just come in all the time. The other day, a soldier was leaving for the front over in Afghanistan, I think, and he posted up, and he had his camos and his backpacks and weapons. He said, preparing to leave, only the essentials for the front, and he had both books stacked up in front of his military gear. And it just goes on and on and on. And I will tell you the quotes from Corinth. There's a really gripping chapter set in Corinth. Saddest funeral I've ever been with, based on that. One of my men was shot and killed at 25. Well, a great young man, you know, frozen forever young. Everybody loved him. That was the saddest funeral I've ever been to. And I describe it in detail in the book. And I'd never been to a funeral where somebody so young died and wasn't wasted by disease or old age. And he looked like he was just napping in his coffin. And his brother, Joe Caldwell, who was circuit clerk, Lane was the one that was shot and killed. He came down to our kickoff down at Reed's, and a lot of people came from the past, and we were reunited with a lot of people, and they told us, they said, you know, you're probably only, they said, you know, you're a new author, and some of the experts said you're a new author, and you'll probably only sell 25, 30, maybe 35 books. We know you're a perfectionist, don't get your hopes up. I signed for 7 hours. We signed 235 books. And so it's been like that ever since, you know. Everything the experts said couldn't happen, has happened, and it's still going. And as soon as I get book 3 out, we're going to start promoting it as a package in the trilogy. I'm going to really start working when I have more time to work the PR side and to speak and to go as long as God gives me the health to do so. And going into the studio myself to try to record audiobooks for all 3. And people ask us all the time about the audiobooks because so many people travel and like to listen to books, and or their eyesight getting weaker like mine, and they like the audiobooks. So we'll be trying to do that. And I would tell y'all, if you hadn't gotten these books in your library, I recommend them to you, of course. And they've just been received so well. And once they go into a place, you know, it's like people like, who is this guy, and why have we never heard of him in some remote place or whatever, and you know, how can we get him up here? So if y'all ever want me to come speak any place I hadn't been, or places I have been, or in libraries or churches, schools, we speak to a lot of churches and schools and civic clubs, please, you've got my cards, you contact me on email or my cell number. We're headed in the morning, Judy, to Fort Walton Beach and Okaloosa Island. I'll be on TV in Pensacola next week and on radio in Destin, and be signing down there and doing a lot of fun stuff too. And so I'll be gone for several weeks. But you can reach me on Facebook, if you friend me, or on my email. Just let me know how we can help you, and I'll be here for a little bit. If anybody, I don't know if y'all want any books today, anybody does. I've got some to sign if anybody wants any. If not, we'd love to work with you to see how we could get books in all the libraries. We set out this year to do that, to offer special deals to some libraries. We wanted to get them everywhere, and a lot of libraries have started to stock them in different counties around the state, and we're getting a good response from them. I will tell you too, and another thrill for me at Adrian Rogers' old church, a 30,000 member Bellevue Baptist, both books are favorites there. They can't get them checked in, and if anybody follows Ravi Zacharias, a great Christian apologist, great author, most brilliant man I've ever studied in my life. One of two men I wanted to meet before I died. One day I get a call from Margie, his wife, from RZIM in Atlanta, and she said, "I read your book, I loved it." She said, "You must meet Ravi. When can you come? He's coming in from a 200-day world tour." And I said, "When do you want me?" So I dropped everything, went to Atlanta right before Christmas, a year before last, and I had a 2-hour private dinner, just me and Ravi. He took me to lunch, and he is the real deal. I'm telling y'all, I highly recommend him. If y'all never read him, he really will tell you how to defend the faith. And he is some guy, and it was, so we just had so many blessings, and Judy and I are just having more fun than two 67-year-olds should probably be allowed to have out on the road together. But God bless y'all, and thank you, and just a pleasure and honor to be here with you. Thank you.